Welcome to the Australian Christian Lobby's Voice for Values.
Welcome to Voice for Values. I'm Martin Isles. Today I want to introduce you to a man named Walt. Walt was one of the first people in the world to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria and to undergo a gender reassignment surgery. And I want you to get to know Walt because the transgender movement is going from strength to strength. Gender theory is taught in schools, it's promoted by universities, and it's pushed by politicians. And all of that is done in the name of compassion. But Walt has lived the transgender life, and he has a very different view. He speaks not only for himself, but for the countless other lives that he has touched through his Transgender Regret counselling ministry. He's a unique man with a unique journey and a compelling message. On today's Voice for Values, ACL's Director of Research, Dr. Elizabeth Taylor, sits down for a conversation with Walt.
Okay, well, I'm joined today by Walt, who is visiting us from the US, and Walt has an amazing testimony and a story of his life, and I just wonder if you could share that with us, Walt.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Well, I started my little journey at the age of 4, so by today's standards, I would have been a transgender kid. That would have been 1944, and of course in 1944, nobody knew what a transgender kid was. They didn't know about gender dysphoria. But I did know that I was being affirmed and groomed by my grandmother, who was affirming me as she was a seamstress, made me a purple chiffon dress. In looking back now, 73 years later, what I realize is that her grooming and affirming my cross-gender behavior was the development of, in my life, of a lot of discomfort with who I was that eventually became psychologically difficult for me to maintain my original, the gender that God had assigned me, and I assumed the gender that Grandma assigned me. And so I worked through that in my mind again till I was in my teens, 20s. I eventually got married, had 2 children, and then in my 30s went to one of these people who claims to be a gender specialist and diagnosed me with gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder and said that the cure for those early childhood feelings was to affirm you and to go on cross-gender hormone therapy and undergo gender reassignment surgery. So I followed the protocols, and here I am today, detransitioned back. What I learned is that being cross-gender behavior is not an identity. It's a developmental disorder that starts in your childhood by someone who has affirmed you in that cross-gender behavior and convinced you that you would be better off if you changed your gender and lived out your life as a transgender person, which I did. I went and became Laura Jensen female and lived that way for 8 years in San Francisco as transgender Laura Jensen, and eventually studied psychology and realized that this was actually a childhood developmental disorder, and that actually required some psychotherapy to recover from. And so with some psychotherapy and better understanding of how gender dysphoria got its name, I was redeemed and restored to my life today and have been for over 25 years, and thankfully no longer a transgender, which is quite a messy life, actually.
So when you said that gender dysphoria is an idea that's introduced to children, we're told repeatedly that gender dysphoria is an innate property that can only be known to the child themselves, that everyone is born with this ineffable quality which is called a gender, and that really it's for parents and adults to back off and not impose any constraints or social stereotypes on a child, that this child is born into the world as a sort of blank canvas, and we are there to discover what's in this package that's been delivered, and that only the child can unpack that for us, because only you know, in the words of the Gender Fairy book, which has been written for children aged 4 to explain gender transition to them and transgenderism. and according to the gender fairy, only you know who you really are. No one can tell you. So what do you think about that idea?
Well, I think it's absolute nonsense. To try to tell me that a young child comes out of the womb knowing that they're transgender is probably about the greatest misconception of who a child is that I've ever heard. The fact of the matter is that we are introducing children to transgenderism. I'm sitting here thinking that, a baby comes out of the womb, the doctor slaps him on the butt, they start to breathe, the little baby slaps him back, the doctor in the face, and says, "I'm a transgender, don't misdirect who I am here." I mean, this is just pure insanity. The fact of the matter is we're indoctrinating these big children, these children. We're affirming them into a transgender identity that they otherwise would never have if we didn't introduce it to them.
Right. So one of the things that I'm concerned about is that discovering who you really are is held up as the answer to all sorts of other problems. If you're distressed and unhappy about who you are now, well, the answer to all of that is to find out who you really are and to sort of go chasing after nutting out this gender identity. And if you can only find that out, and so for example in the Safe Schools program, children are told that gender exists on a spectrum between masculine and feminine, and sex exists on a spectrum, and sexual orientation exists on a spectrum, and that you could be anywhere on this spectrum. They all vary independently of one another, and of course the task of teenagers, of adolescents, is to find out who you are in the world, and that this is being presented as the 3 building blocks of identity. In fact, that's exactly how they phrase it, the 3 building blocks of identity. If you can just work out which combination of these 3 things you are, then you will have found the answer to the quintessential you. And from what you're saying, that's holding out a sort of false promise of...
Well, what they're actually doing is trying to teach you who you really aren't. So it's not about finding out who you really are. They're trying to teach you who you really aren't.
I see. So
yes. So, they're trying to tell you you're something that you're not, because that plays into their agenda and their nonsense. I know that I lived through this, and I look back on it, and I still continue to say it's child abuse to try to tell someone that they're not who they really are, and that's what they're telling them. They're teaching them who they really are not, and trying to get them to behave in a lack of reality of who they really aren't.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for putting that so clearly. I think we'll pause there and come back in a moment.
Voice for Values at acl.org.au.
Welcome back to Voice for Values. On today's episode, ACL's Director of Research, Dr. Elizabeth Taylor, sits down for a conversation with former transgender Walt Heyer.
We're talking about the subject of gender dysphoria in children, and Walt is saying that in his opinion, it's dreamt up by adults and imposed on children to teach them who they really aren't. Now, I think this is an interesting idea about identity, and I wonder if you could explain a little bit further, Walter, about a child's identity, how it is that it's being formed and transformed, and who would want to do that to a child?
Well, I think there's a lot of people who get very confused about children who are curious about gender. And I think it's very healthy for young people to have a curiosity about gender, about their own identity. What isn't unhealthy is to suggest that they can select a gender like it was a vending machine. And to do this, I think, is where we begin to harm children in suggesting, well, you can just pick any gender you want, you can explore, you can experiment, and you can cruise through this life by testing out these different gender realities. What I find in working with the people, this is how I came to this conclusion, is that I work with the people on the other end. I work primarily with people who have what we call detransition. They lived the life. They went through it as young people. They come back today, and they're the ones writing me, saying that the whole thing was nonsense. It was the biggest mistake that ever happened to them. Like it was for me with my grandmother cross-dressing me. Hundreds of people that I've worked with come back later on and say, this was the biggest mistake of my life. Why did someone guide me down this path? I was never that person in the first place. It's all fake. It's all nonsense. It's all made up by adults. It's an adult agenda. It's not an agenda put on by young people. Young people don't have any idea what a transgender is. I didn't when I was 4 years old. Anybody who suggests to me that a 2, 3, or 4-year-old kid knows the consequences of assuming or adopting a different gender identity is absolutely a blithering idiot. I'm sorry.
No, I think that's very clear. That there is an agenda that I've seen to normalise transgenderism and to say gender expression should be free. We should release it from the binary. We shouldn't have these fixed ideas of what men and women look like. Androgyny is very clearly promoted, particularly for young people in the media. And there's this bizarre new fashion for drag queens, having drag queens read to toddlers in libraries.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
Well, again, it's indoctrination. This is how we groom people. It's a grooming process. This is in my view, a very sick behavior done by people who really don't care about the children, who are very interested in expanding an agenda that perpetrates these whole group of ideologies about whether it's a drag queen or whether it's a transvestic fetish or whether it's autogynephilia or some other thing that no one's willing to talk about. They're actually sick behaviors. And so we're promoting this to young children. And why today, in the last studies that I looked at, age group 12 to 24 are attempting suicide at a rate of nearly 50% in this young population. Why? Because we're teaching them how to be a gender and a person that they're really not. And so they're not equipped psychologically or emotionally or socially to deal with this indoctrination process, this grooming process that's put upon them by adults.
And the adults want to do this to young people because that affirms their own sense of who they are? Or
well, I think in their mind, they feel like they're the most enlightened, that they've found some new level of experience in life that's greater than those people who only like male and female. Like there's something beyond that, and it's some kind of magical different level. Well, I'm sorry, there isn't anything beyond male and female.
Right.
It's just some people's imagination to try to expand the male and female into something that isn't. That's why I say we're teaching them who they really aren't.
Yes. What you said just resonated very strongly with something I was saying, quoting yesterday from Ros Ward, who explains that this whole idea that there is a binary, that men and women should be heterosexually attracted and marry and live in families and then look after the children in those families, that's all an ideology, an ideological construct to just smooth the operation of capitalism for the benefit of the overlords. And so it's not just LGBT people will be liberated by the glorious revolution that she envisages. It's all of us poor mugs who didn't realise that we were oppressed into believing that we were male or female.
Well, see, I have the benefit of catching them on the other side. We're talking about people who are just entering this world of, quote, transgenderism, which is just a code word for bad behavior. And so what we have is, on the other side, the people come to me with tremendous regret, lives that are torn apart. Now they want me to restore their life. This is where I work. This is the area that I work. On the other side, the regretters, the people who didn't commit suicide. Many of them attempted suicide, and so now I'm working with the people from 3 months to 30 years later. You have these people coming back and saying, this is the biggest mistake of my life. Can you help me restore the life that was taken from me by this whole LGBT agenda?
Wow. And have they been living with regret for a long time? Or?
Well, sometimes it takes, once they realize it, people report as much as 2 or 3 years they live wondering, how do I get out of this? You know, where do I go? Where do I turn to? And so they see my website, sexchangeregret.com. They contact me and say, how do I restore my life? Can you help me? And that's where I begin to affirm them that it's okay to detransition because you actually never changed genders in the first place.
I think that what your work is really at the heart of all of this, because everybody who feels the distress of people, and I understand the distress of gender dysphoria, as it's termed, is very upsetting for people. And everybody would want to help them, but you're saying that actually affirming them or acknowledging them as a gender anything other than cognizant with their biological sex, that's not helping them.
Yeah, if you're affirming them in the opposite gender that they were given birth to, then what you're doing is furthering your agenda. You're not helping the child. they're going to follow you because they're young, but they're only going to follow you for a while. We already know that somewhere between 70 and 94% of them by adulthood wish they hadn't got into that and will grow out of it. If we don't ingest them with hormones, if we don't continue to affirm them, if we do, we can actually manufacture more transgender kids. Is that what we really want to do? I say no.
Voice for Values from the Australian Christian Lobby at acl.org.au.